When a suspected case of child abuse or neglect arises, the first call goes to a child protection intake worker. As the front line of America's child protection system, intake workers field millions of reports of child maltreatment each year. And they're then faced with the daunting decision that may ultimately result in the death of a child or the breakup of a family unit. They make these high-stakes decisions with incomplete information and limited resources, influenced by their training, government policies, experience, and personal biases. The potential for human error is high, resulting in a system of surveillance and intervention that falls disproportionately on Black, Indigenous, and poor families. Research finds that racial disparities exist at every step of the child protection process, from intake screening to the decision to remove a child from the home or terminate parental rights. Research also demonstrates that, in many cases, such interventions may be both unnecessary to protecting a child and may result in trauma to individuals, families, and communities. Bridging the gap between the desire to protect children and the disproportionate and devastating impact investigation and removal have on Black and Brown communities in particular is one strand of the research agenda of our next speaker, Dr. Rhema Vaithianathan. Dr. Vaithianathan's research seeks to marshal the power of big data to solve public problems without exacerbating or perpetuating social inequities. In her current role as director of the Center for Social Data Analytics at Auckland University of Technology, a center she helped found, Dr. Vaithianathan leads a multidisciplinary team of scholars, and she functions as a translator between data scientists, the general public, and the marginalized communities she aims to help through data-driven research. The result is a research agenda that includes the perspectives of underrepresented groups in developing policy solutions related to health, housing, and child protection. In addition to serving in multiple academic positions, Dr. Vaithianathan, an economist by training, has worked in several government positions, including as a policy analyst for the New Zealand Treasury, and has directed the Singapore Life Panel since 2014, a monthly survey of Singaporean citizens. I am honored to welcome Dr. Rima Vaithianathan to the Nobel Conference.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm going to speak to you about some of the work we've been doing in child welfare. And the title of my talk is Too Much and Not Enough. And for the first aspect of too much and not enough, I want to talk about our child protection system. That is one of the hardest systems that we as society ask our government to operate. And that is the system for protecting children from abuse and harm. The reason it's so hard is that it's done in the full floodlight of public attention. And there are two camps that most of the public attention falls on. The first camp will often be an article like the one in the New York Times saying we've got too many children being investigated, too many children being removed. The other camp, often without irony, in the same newspaper, will be an article saying, we don't have enough. There are tragic deaths happening every day where our child welfare system should have intervened earlier, should have intervened with more attention. So today's talk, I'm going to talk about what hard decisions our child welfare system, and in particular the social workers and frontline workers who are part of the system, have to make. And the fact that they're having to make these decisions in very fast time and with a lot of emotion surrounding it means that as workers and professionals, they will end up using mental shortcuts, what we call heuristics. And when people are using those heuristics, we know that giving them curated data tools like predictive analytics tools can help. But the fact is that what I'm going to talk to you today about is that whilst those data tools are available to us in great abundance, the most important part of getting these data tools to these frontline workers who we've charged with making incredibly difficult decisions is not a technical problem. It's a problem for society. It's a problem of social license. So in the US, every year, there are almost 4 million reports being made to local child welfare officers saying that someone in the community, a teacher, a doctor, a neighbor, a family member, is concerned that the child is being maltreated, abused, or neglected. What happens when those reports come in is that a call screener, and this is a typical example of one, will be sitting in an office taking that call and often spending no more than 10 minutes having to make the decision of whether they're going to investigate that report or screen them out. When they screen them out, it's essentially doing nothing about it. About half of all the reports that happen in the US are screened out. The other decision they can make is to investigate. And what is an investigation? An investigation entails a social worker or child welfare worker going out to meet the family. They might meet neighbors, they might meet friends. They ask a whole bunch of questions, often quite intrusive questions. History, any evidence of domestic violence, what's their income, what are their employment conditions. And then at the end of that, the investigator makes an assessment about whether the allegation that was reported to them was substantiated, whether there was any merit in that allegation. The question that we constantly get when we work in child welfare is, are we investigating too many children? And in some sense, I think the evidence is we are. 1 in 3 American children are subject to investigation before they turn 18. 1 in 3. So if you're in a class right now of 30 other students in your class, that means that 10 of your classmates will be subject to that kind of investigation, or their family will, within their first 18 years of life. At the end of those investigations across the country, only around 15% are actually found to be with some merit, that is substantiated. Now, that's still not to say that those other investigations were not worth their while, but it does give you a sense of how pervasive the child welfare investigation system is. And as concerning is how racially disproportionate that investigation are. Remember I said 1 in 3 children in the country are investigated by 18? Well, for Black and African American children, that number is more like 1 in 2. 1 in 2 Black and African American families are subject to someone coming out, talking to family, talking to neighbors, talking to teachers, and make an assessment if that child was being maltreated. So it starts to sound like we might be investigating too many children. But I can give you statistics that make it sound like maybe we're not investigating enough. Now, in Allegheny County, which is the surrounding area around Pittsburgh, where we've done a lot of work, almost half the children who end up being killed or almost killed because of neglect or abuse, almost half of them have never been investigated. We also see constantly in our newspapers tragic stories where children were again almost killed or tragically killed, and the reporters go and dig into their history and find evidence that the child welfare system did not get involved when they were given an opportunity, didn't do as much or as early as they could have. A good example of that is a Netflix documentary called The Trials of Gabriel Fernandez, which cover the life and early death of a young boy in California, in Los Angeles, in fact, where the child had been subject to some terrible hardship and torture, but child welfare had been involved, but had clearly not done as much as it could have. So this not too much and not enough means that our frontline workers who every day are trying to do the best they can to make that juggling act, to balance the need to leave families to carry on their own, but also to protect children when they need it, are constantly in a state of stress. This is just one social worker who was interviewed for a study. She said call screening can be really stressful. You're constantly having to read through those referrals, having to prioritize and make decisions with your duty manager about what needs responding to ASAP, that is, it's urgent, and what can wait. There is a second aspect, however, in this too much and not enough. And that's about how much information our frontline workers are deluged with when they're making that decision. One of the professors of social work, Brian Taylor, who has really spent his whole life trying to understand frontline decision-making in child welfare, says it like this: our child welfare organizations emphasize gathering all the relevant information. But what the social worker is supposed to do with this information, what use is to be made of it, is a matter of professional discretion. That brings us to the very real problem of information overload. There is this concept that, of course, more information is better, but at some point, professionals, clinicians, social workers, psychologists, they're overwhelmed with the amount of information and data that they have in front of them. And if that data is not standardized, is not curated, is not summarized, it's almost counterproductive and decision-making performance can fall. One of the real reasons for this is a human phenomena that we're all very easily prone to. We all know we do this, and that is the use of what's called a heuristic. A heuristic is a strategy that ignores part of the information with the goal of making decisions more accurately, quickly, frugally. That is, when we're overwhelmed with multiple pieces of information, often information that can be quite contradictory, humans have a tendency to limit attention to just a few pieces, to use a mental shortcut, to simplify our complex models. Now, there have been almost 100 years of research into the impact of heuristics. But for us in child welfare, in this particular context, there are sort of two real concerns about the implications of human heuristics. One is that when people are doing those mental shortcuts, they can be very poor at predicting the course of outcomes for a particular family, a patient, a child that they're working with. The second is that even though humans and professionals in particular are subject to heuristics, because they're being asked to make these decisions, and quite high-stakes decisions, they can start to believe that they have a special power in the making of these decisions, that they have some superior intuition that makes their decisions really good. So let me first address the inaccurate predictions. In 1954, in a really landmark study, Meal studied over 20 papers which compared the accuracy of clinical psychologists mainly making assessments of patients about the course of their condition, what would happen to those patients, against a very simple statistical model. And he found that in every case, a simple statistical model was more accurate than the clinical psychologist. And he also found evidence that the reason for the departure is that the clinical psychologists were making systematic errors. The illusion of validity is, as I said, that people, when they're asked to constantly make high-stakes decisions under high levels of stress, they start to believe they have a superior intuition to what is going to happen. And even if they're shown data which contradicts their perspicacity, which contradicts how good they are, they do end up thinking that they're still right. And this unjustified sense of confidence is called illusion of validity. Now, there is a huge debate that goes on today in human decision-making. And that debate is really very central to the use of predictive risk modeling, models, algorithms, other kind of data tools to support human decisions. One type of proponents are people who claim to be naturalistic decision makers. They claim that humans do have superior intuition, that people have amazing expert intuition, many times superior to any machine learning tool. The other camp, the other group argue that humans are subject to a multitude of mistakes, of heuristics, of biases, and that data science tools like machine learning tools can really help to reduce these biases. I suppose I fall into the latter camp. Well, when I go to a new place, you'll use Google Maps. And what does Google Maps tell me? It gives me a prediction of my travel times. It tries to help me map a course around a particular neighborhood. Now, we all know if I'm going from home to work, which is what I've mapped there, I would never use Google Maps because I have my human intuition. I know exactly what I'm doing. When I'm in a completely foreign place, I'm going to rely a lot on this tool. Sometimes, even at home, I'll use the tool if I'm in a rush and I want to know the shortest cut. So what we've developed for child welfare workers is such a tool that we call a family screening tool. It's a tool where a child welfare worker can use it if they start feeling uncertain. They don't have to use it if they're 100% certain they know what they're doing, but it helps them provide some additional summarized data of what they're doing. And so I'm going to turn to how we develop this tool for use in child welfare workers who are doing that screening decision in Allegheny County. So how does Allegheny County Child Welfare make these decisions? When a call comes in, they look up multiple data systems, they look up the screening tool, They talk to their supervisors and they decide whether to investigate or not. And what is that tool that they look up? It's called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool. It's a predictive risk model. It predicts the likelihood that the child on that referral will have an out-of-home placement within 2 years of that call. That is, something will happen in the next 2 years that makes a social worker and a judge so concerned about the safety of the child continuing to live where they live that the child will be removed from their home and placed somewhere else for their safety. That is almost the most extreme type of protection action that child welfare takes. So when a call comes in, the way the tool works is it harvests data from a data warehouse. So in Allegheny County, when children are reported to child welfare, the county runs what's called a data warehouse. That allows the county to discover the history of the child, the mom, the alleged perpetrator, and other people associated with the call in multiple public systems, in behavioral health, in county jail, in homelessness, in previous child welfare referrals, which are by and large the most valuable to know the history of this child. Now, just to be clear, these are all systems that the call screener was able to look at even before they started using our tool. Remember how I told you that the second step when a call came in was for them to look up the systems? Well, that's the data systems they were looking at. But imagine you're given 10 minutes to decide whether to screen a child in or not. You have 6 or 7 systems that you can look up to help you make a decision. That is almost the definition of information overload. So what we've done is taken all those data pieces, put them together, discovered patterns, and given them a summary which says this child is at very high, very low, middle risk of a removal. So how accurate is the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, or the AFST? So to check its accuracy, what we did is we applied it to some referrals that had come into Allegheny historically. Now, these were not referrals we had used to so-called train the model, but these were referrals that were more than 2 years old, so we could follow what happened to the course of those children. So when a child scored a 20, when we followed them in the data for 2 years, we found around half of those children would have been removed, or in fact were removed. Then we followed the children who scored a 1. 1 in 100 of those children were removed within 2 years. The scores that are generated by the Allegheny Family Screening Tool are spread between 1 and 20. So a 20 pretty much tells you there's a 50% chance of removal. A 1 tells you there's a sort of 1% chance of removal. Then we also were curious about what were families experiencing prior to the introduction of the tool. How were those call screeners who were really trying to do a fabulous job trying to identify which children were at risk, how well were they able to do that? What we found is that 27% of the highest risk cases were not investigated. 48% of the lowest risk cases were investigated. So what does that tell us? It says that, remember, there was a 1 in 100 chance that that low-risk child was going to be removed. And yet we were investigating half of them. There was a 1 in 2 chance that the highest risk cases were going to be removed. and we're screening out 1/3 of them. So that suggests that what we had been doing in Allegheny prior to the tool wasn't very lined up with whatever it was, the patterns that the AFST was seeing in the data. Of course, we're also concerned that the AFST is only predicting our child welfare's own actions. We want to know, but do we independently know that this child who scores a 1 is not at risk of bad outcomes? Is the child who scores a 20 really at risk of bad outcomes? And so to find that out, we did a little research exercise where we took a sample of children, scored them, and then looked at their hospitalization records. So we were able to see what they were hospitalized for, what those diagnoses were. What we found is that a child who scores a 20 compared to a child who scores a 1 is 21 times more likely to attend for a self-inflicted injury, that is suicide or self-harm, and 17 times more likely to attend hospital for physical assault. So these are suggesting to us that the scores are validated not just on removals, which is at the end of the day just a decision a social worker and a judge have made, but independent corroborating evidence through hospitalization records. So what I've really outlined to you right now is we have a problem. We have to make these screening decisions. We have a tool, kind of like Google Map, which can help make sense to child welfare workers to support them when they make these really hard decisions. Now, you in the audience, you're members of the community. How comfortable do you feel about your jurisdictions, the state you live in, the county you live in? How comfortable do you feel if you knew that every day child welfare workers were using this tool to help them make those decisions? What would make you more comfortable? That's the question that dominates my research agenda. My research agenda at the end of the day is not about the technical building of the tool. It's not even about the big problems in systems like child welfare. My true research agenda is how do we get these tools to address a big problem in a way that those tools make people comfortable. And that is not the technical challenge, but the social challenge. And I tend to call this a social license. So social license is something that we get from our community. Our community says, yes, I trust that the way the data is going to be used is the way that I've agreed to. And yes, I accept that there is enough value in the use of these tools to make it justifiable. Now, social license is much more than simply ticking boxes or meeting the minimal standards that legislation might require of us, or HIPAA, or whatever other requirements there are of data sharing and data use. Social license has to be refreshed regularly, and it is really about the accord between the community understanding and accepting the use of their data and the agency saying that they will use the tools the way they've promised. Now, at my center, which is the Center for Social Data Analytics, we have sort of 6 main components to achieving and maintaining social license. Let me go through each of those. The first is we really believe strongly in agency leadership. Almost all the work we do, we're a translational research center, so almost all the work we do is in collaboration with agencies like Allegheny County Department of Health and Human Services. We work with Health and Human Services around the world, ministries, and so on. We strongly believe that the agency is always the one in charge. It should have access to all this data. It should have access to all our code. It should have access to all our tools. It is the one in charge. It's the one that's supporting its community. It's the one that's requiring us to solve a problem for it. We also are very committed to transparency and fairness. In the current world, when there is a lot of concerns about the use of this sort of technology, we think sunlight is the best way to maintain trust amongst those who might not trust the use of data. And so we always publish a methodology report, technical documents, frequently asked questions. We work with the agency to share our results in conferences, online, and other fora. Just right from the start, people get to understand what we're doing and get to have a voice. And that's a third and crucial part of our gaining and maintaining social license is the idea of community voice. We really believe that the people who are destined to be part of the system ought to have a voice in the building of that system. So data science tool like the AFST is a tool to help screen families in child welfare. So we have, right from the get-go, spoken to families who've had experience of child welfare systems, adults who might have aged out of child welfare systems. Explained to them what the purpose of this tool is, what the problem it was trying to fix, and listened to what their concerns were and taken those concerns on board. We also firmly believe that these sorts of tools are not tools that ought to be done by simply computer scientists or data scientists. They need multidisciplinary teams which have a large role for domain experts. So, for example, the Allegheny Family Screening Tool has a research team which is co-led by Emily Putnam-Hornstein, who's a professor of social work at UNC Chapel Hill. And together, we've been doing most of this work in child welfare. In many of our use cases, we've also reached out to professors of philosophy, ethicists, and asked them to develop an independent line of ethical advice to the agency. And with the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, if you go online, you will see an independent ethical advice given to the agency and a response from the agency to those ethical points. We also believe that the quality of these tools are only as good as the impact that they have on the families that the child welfare system is trying to serve. We do not evaluate, as researchers, we don't evaluate our own tools. We deploy them in child welfare systems and now increasingly in other systems like homelessness systems. And we support the agency often to do an open call for an evaluation partner who we then share our data with, who develops and produces independent evaluation reports. So there is an evaluation partner, a team at Stanford, who've developed and published an interim evaluation report of Allegheny Family Screening Tool, and that's also available online. One of the things that make people most uncomfortable, possibly, about the use of these sorts of data science tools is the concern that they might exacerbate those racial disparities that I've already spoken about. Remember how I said that 1 in 3 American children will be investigated by the age of 18? Well, for Black and African families, that number is more like 1 in 2. So there is clearly a challenge of racial disproportionality in our child welfare system. And people say, well, the data you're using, the system you're predicting in has those features to it. So isn't the tool going to exacerbate it? So for ourselves to feel comfortable about what this tool is doing in that domain and to communicate what the tool is doing, we asked 3 questions in the realm of racial disproportionality. The first question we ask is the tool equally accurate in predicting removals for both black and white children? In Allegheny, there are not many other subgroups, so we're really looking at black and white. We also ask, is it equally accurate in predicting out-of-system harm? It's all very well being accurate in predicting own system, like removals. If we think removals themselves are done in a biased way, then surely just proving that it's predictive of removals is not going to give us comfort. We'll also ask whether it's racially disproportionate for more universal measures of maltreatment. The third question we ask is, at the end of the day, when people started using this tool, did it exacerbate or reduce racial disproportionality? So the first question for Allegheny, we looked at whether, and this is a more recent data set, this is just data from the use of the tool, we followed the children who were scored when the tool was in play and asked, are black children being removed at similar rates for similar scores at white children? And we found that overall, the accuracy is similar. So that picture, on the horizontal line is the risk score. I remember I told you the Allegheny Family Screening Tool has a risk of 1 to 20. On the vertical axis is the proportion of children who score that particular score who end up being removed. The black bars are the subgroup who are black or African American, and the blue bars are the subgroup who are white. So you do see a slightly higher removal rates for black and African American children who score a 20, but the overall accuracy as measured by the area under curve is similar for both groups. The second question we asked was, if we took a sample of children who were scored by the tool, black children and white children, and matched it with hospitalization rates for maltreatment, which is a fairly objective measure of harm, in the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital, which is the only hospital that children from the whole Pittsburgh area ever get admitted to, would we say that a black and a white child who scored a 20 had similar rates of maltreatment hospitalization? So this picture, the horizontal axis is the AFSD score, 1 to 20. The vertical axis is the rate of maltreatment hospitalization. As you expect, and as we see, there is a positive graded relationship, which means that children who score a higher AFSD have a higher rate of maltreatment hospitalization than children who score a lower score. What you also see, especially in those very high-risk groups, is that the rate of maltreatment hospitalization for black children is very similar to the rate of hospitalization for white children. The rest of it is fairly higgledy-piggledy, and that's because the sample size is quite small. And with rates like this, you're going to expect a lot of variation when the rates are very low. But there is definitely evidence that for maltreatment hospitalization, at least, the scores are picking up similar risk in black and white children. The third question we asked is the use of the tool having an impact to reduce or exacerbate disproportionality? So the answer to that question is a little bit complicated, so let me go through it very slowly. The left-hand side column, called AFST graph. On the horizontal axis, what I've done is I've combined those 20s into groups of 10. So when you see a score of 1, it's actually a 1 to 2 on the AFST scale. A score of 10 is 19 and 20. What we've done is we've gone back and scored children who were being looked at by call screeners before the score was available to them. So this is what call screeners were doing prior to the introduction of the AFST. And what does that picture show you? The red curve is black, the blue curve is white. So what the black curve shows you is that score to score, call screeners were screening in more black children than white children who scored the same score. Now, middle row and the final AFST version 2 is the final protocols and version of AFST as it's being run today. And what do you see there? Allegheny County has put a lot of effort into educating and systematizing how the AFST tool is being used, particularly for high and low risk children. So what you're seeing there is that for the highest risk children, more children are being screened in, for sure. But the black and white rates have now become laying on top of each other. That is, the disproportionality has completely gone. And what's also happened is that the lowest risk black children are now being screened in less. So what this suggests is that perhaps Allegheny Family Screening Tool staff, Allegheny screening staff were using a kind of a mental shortcut that saw race as risk. They were unable to see risk in white families and tended to see more risk in black families. Now when they see a tool, the tool is showing them that there are lots of black families who don't score very high. And there are some white families who have higher scores. And it is reducing the disproportionality in the way that they're screening. Now, I think it's really important that when we look at the use of these sorts of data tools, that we don't see them as the panacea for some of the most challenging issues we have in the world. A good example is Auckland police, who have been amazing in the use of data tools to try to document, and they have documented very well, disproportionality and to try to reduce it. But more data in that case didn't reduce disproportionality in police stops. So more data is part of the answer, but is rarely the complete answer. So for those of you who are interested, there are lots of places you can read about our work. We will be featured in a number of outlets, and we are very welcome to go and look those up and see more information on our website as well. So the last aspect, or coming back to the title of the talk, I guess for me, the lesson is that sometimes the deployment of these tools, we can get overzealous and over-concentrated on the technical components of these tools. Think of these as a technocratic problem. They are not. They are much more a social problem. So for those of you in the audience, and I know at this university there would be many, who are really interested in the social challenges of using this type of technology to really address some of our biggest challenges in the world today, I really urge you to not get caught up in becoming another technocrat, but think about how, as social scientists, you can bring the ideas of social license, of gaining and retaining trust to better use these sorts of technologies to address and reduce some of our biggest challenges. So thank you so much for inviting me, and I look forward to hearing the panelists on the conversation about this talk.
And welcome back. I'm here again with Kate Knutson of the Department of Political Science, and we're going to have a little bit of time to talk about what we just saw in Professor Vaithianathan's talk. And before we launch into that discussion, I want to remind you that if you'd like to participate in our little poll, sort of inspired by Professor Vaithianathan's talk, you can do so at pollev.com/Nobel57, or you can text Nobel 57 to the number 22333 and then text your answer. It's just kind of fun to see where the audience's head is around things. Also, please feel free to check in on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. Nobel Conference is pretty much our handle for all of those, I guess. Nobel Conference 2021 if you are on Instagram. So Kate, one of the things that I wanted to start with maybe is a question about what Professor Vaithianathan was saying about that illusion of validity, the sense that humans are always better deciders, as opposed to the view that humans always make mistakes. And as we think about that with respect to the kind of model that Dr. Vaithianathan is talking about, how do you see the model kind of helping us to address that? And are there any ways in which the model might not work effectively to address that illusion of validity?
It's a great question. I think one of the things that I appreciate about Dr. Vaithianathan is that she is very empathetic to the frontline workers, to sort of what we would call the street level bureaucrats. I think she views them as very hardworking, and she just comes across as having a lot of empathy for the types of challenging decisions that they are likely to face in their professions. But I think by recognizing the way in which people have this illusion of validity is really an important part of what she does, because when people are in a context where they're making high stakes decisions on a very regular basis, it becomes very easy to rationalize decisions or justify decisions as sort of that backward looking justification. And so, when you deal with social workers, for example, who have been in the field for 20 years, they have developed a lot of expertise. And so then when they're making decisions, they rely on those decisions. And in the cases where, something goes wrong, then they can sort of backward justify their positions. And so what this model does, I think, is really useful, is it gives them an alternative tool, sort of like an external reference point for them to connect with, to check their own preconceived biases or experiences against that reality. Now, where it can break down, as she mentioned, is that the child protection workers are not required to use the score. It's a tool that they use. And in many ways, that's very good. You don't want to just have an algorithm making the decision for you in really complicated cases involving human beings and human families and dynamics. But I think when you combine those two factors, that illusion of validity, the risk that it runs because the child protection workers are not required to use the score that they get from the screening tool, it does run the risk of them choosing to ignore that number. And so I think that, probably in future research, one of the things that scholars could look at is the extent to which the model holds up in cases when the workers are using the number versus when they are excluding that screening number. And maybe, whether or not Allegheny County is keeping records of the extent to which the workers are using that number, I think would be really important.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, that's really interesting. And I really appreciate what you were saying about the ways in which Dr. Vaithianathan emphasized her compassion for the workers doing this work. I have to say, as someone very ignorant about this field, I was sobered. The thought that someone has to make a decision about whether to screen in or out a child in really 10 minutes in a small cubicle looking at a screen. I mean, I can't decide between a B and a B minus on a paper sometimes in 10 minutes. So the enormous task that workers face, suggests it definitely deserves nothing but our compassion. So Dr. Vaithianathan's work is obviously focused, she doesn't exclusively work in this area, we know, but she's done a great deal of work on child protection. What are some other places, you're a political scientist, I know that you do research somewhat related to this, I think. What are some other places that governments are turning to these kinds of data algorithms, maybe with similar success or maybe with more challenges?
Mm-hmm. We see these kinds of algorithms being used in a lot of different places in government. So my area of expertise is public policy, and actually child welfare policy is one of my areas of research, which is how Dr. Vaithianathan got brought into this topic. But I think we learned this morning from Dr. Rudin about some of the ways in which algorithms like this, predictive risk modeling algorithms, are being used in the criminal justice system. And I think that's probably one of the most controversial places that these are being used in public domains right now. But they're being used in a variety of ways, calculating a predicted score for recidivism to make decisions about what's going to happen pre-trial. Will you allow somebody to be out on their own reconnaissance, or are you going to require some sort of bail? They're being used in decisions about parole. They're being used in decisions about sentencing. But they're also being used on the front end in decisions about policing, where to allocate policing resources based on past criminal behavior. And so that's really a very controversial area where these are being used. They're also being used in other social welfare policies. So in the provision of public welfare benefits, and also in homelessness allocation of resources. And so thinking about, in terms of the homeless population, they sort of think about people that are in a set of crises situations versus chronic homelessness, and thinking about how to allocate scarce resources like beds or apartments based on some of the likelihood of people being able to use the time when they're housed in order to get back on their feet. Mm-hmm. And so those are just some of the ways I think that governments are using it. I would guess that just about every state in the country is using some algorithm in one of these domains at this point.
Wow. Every state, you think?
Just about, yeah.
That's pretty astonishing. When you think about what we've been hearing this morning about the number of ways in which race can be proxied, if I can turn it into a verb, the number of things that stand in as proxies for race, we haven't until now really talked intensively about child welfare. So why are public policy areas like child welfare so prone to racially disproportionate outcomes? Is it that more of these proxies enter the picture? Is it that there are even more proxies that we haven't even talked about yet at this conference? Or what's going on there that this disproportion is so stark?
There are a lot of things going on there. I think, if I had to choose, one of the things that I think exacerbates the disproportionality in the case of child protection is the sheer number of decision points that are involved in this area. So if you think through the entire process, there's the initial decision to make a call to a child protection agency. And that comes often from mandated reporters, so teachers or doctors. It comes from neighbors. It comes from family members. So that initial decision point is rife with personal biases, right? So if you think about, being out at the grocery store and seeing a mom interacting with her kid, and how often have you sort of thought, wow, that's a kind of a weird interaction, or that seems sort of abusive, right? So that's that initial data point of, do you call do you call child protection or not? And so where racial biases really play in there is, I think people are, so we live in racially segregated neighborhoods, for one thing, and we make a lot of decisions based on implicit biases. And so often we will make decisions that maybe perpetuate some of those racist biases that we have. So that's the first point. Then you get the point of the intake worker. So it's another decision point. And again, what we saw from Dr. Vaithianathan's data there is those intake workers aren't always great at making decisions about when a child is actually at risk, because they're also sort of dealing with their own preconceived biases. One of the things that's happening at that point is really making a decision about whether or not the report that's come in actually violates state or county law about child protection. So some of those have nothing to do with biases. It's just a matter of whether it rises to the level of the statutory definition of child abuse. But those can also be affected. Then you have, so if you screen a child in, and most cases are screened out, so they don't go anywhere, but once you screen a child in, then in many states like Minnesota, you have a decision to make about whether or not you're going to go to an investigation or whether you're just going to offer the family resources. Family assessment is the language that's used here. So it's sort of like these three big critical decisions. And then as you go down the road, then you have a whole bunch of other decision points, like whether or not you're going to remove the child from the home, whether or not you're going to move to terminate parental rights. So at each of these decisions, you have the potential to introduce personal biases. And there's lots of decisions that come in other aspects of public policy, but I think for child welfare, there are so many different decision points, and it's so decentralized that it really lends itself to being a system with disproportionate impacts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that specific detail, Kate. That was really helpful. So one of the things that Dr. Vaithianathan talked about was this notion of a social license, which contains sort of six elements that they maintain and renew. So she asks the question, how comfortable are we in the government using tools like this model in Allegheny County? So what are some of the ways in which you think people hearing this might, or in which you think about how you would answer that question? What should we be thinking about as we attempt to answer that question?
The question of social license, I do think, is at the heart of all of the work that's being done that has to do with applying algorithms to public policy. And I was really interested in the panel discussion yesterday afternoon, where I think that they kind of tapped into one of the biggest challenges which has emerged in recent years, which is really sort of thinking about trust in our political system. They can develop a great algorithm that really is effective, but if people don't trust that and don't trust sort of what's going into it, don't trust what's coming out of it, but even today, don't trust the people who are implementing it or carrying out the results of the algorithm, we're in a pretty challenging situation. And how to fix that, I think, is the million-dollar question right now. I think, this ties back to some of our discussions that the panelists have been having about social media networks and communication networks right now, and how disinformation spreads. And I think it's going to take more of a system-wide solution to get to the point where people will trust government with this information. Because right now, I think we're at a point where there is deep distrust of government. And with an issue like this that involves racial disparities, we don't just have the 70 million people that Dr. Ulsterholm was talking about that distrust vaccines, but we also have people on the left who distrust the use of data that leads to racially disproportionate outcomes. Mm-hmm.
We have just a little sliver of time, but we want to make sure that we at least take a look at the poll that has been being answered about, inspired by Dr. Vaithianathan's work. How should child welfare organizations use these sorts of tools? It should be one tool among many, or we should never use it. It should be up to the discretion of the agency, or we should use every tool we can. Those were the choices. So I wonder, wonder what our results are going to say. So, thoughts? I was very
Well-
interested in this one. I couldn't have called it.
Yep, this is a hard one. They should be one tool among many that frontline workers can use is the majority of our sample. And I think I love the split between A and D because I think that that perfectly captures Dr. Vaithianathan's predicament that she gave us, which is, are we protecting children? Are we sort of making the decision, are we leaving this decision to the experts? And so to see that split, I think is really useful. But I think people are showing a preference for using the data that we have in ways that we can, but not replacing the human decision-making factor in a field like child protection.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it looks like it really quite closely represents what, in fact, the Allegheny County workers are presently doing, using it as one tool. Great. Well, Kate, I want to thank you so much for joining me here today to talk about Rima Vaithianathan's work.